Okay, so Night is it's a very short novel. I knocked it out actually in the middle of a flight, so it doesn't take that long to go through. There's 10 chapters. I don't know how deep we're going to go today. What I'm going to get us to do is I'm just going to get us to flip to the. We're not going to go straight to. We're going to go to the preface. So it's going to be VII. So it's like the third or fourth page in. So I'll give you a second to head to the preface there. I'm not gonna have it on my screen. I'll just read directly from my book here. So this is preface to the new translation by L.E. Wiesel. This was translated for him because at the time when he wrote it, he did not do English very well. So if in my lifetime I was to write only one book, this would be the one. Just as the past lingers in the present, all of my writings after Night, including those that deal with biblical, Talmudic, or Hasmatic themes, profoundly bear a stamp and cannot be understood if one is to not read the very first of my works. Why did I write it? Did I write it so as not to go mad? On the contrary, to go mad in order to understand the nature of madness, the immense, terrifying madness that had erupted in history and in the conscience of mankind. Was it to leave behind a legacy of words, of memories to help prevent history from repeating itself? Or was it simply to preserve a record of the ordeal I endured as an adolescent, at an age when one's knowledge of death and evil should be limited to what one discovers in literature? There are those who tell me that I survived in order to write this text. I am not convinced. I don't know how I survived. I was weak, rather shy. I did nothing to save myself. A miracle? Certainly not. If heaven could or would perform a miracle for me, why not for the others more deserving than myself? If nothing, it was nothing more than chance. However, having survived, I needed to give some meaning to my survival. Was it to protect that meaning that I set to paper an experience in which nothing made any sense? In retrospect, I must confess that I did not know or no longer know what I wanted to achieve with my words. I only know that without this testimony, my life as a writer, or my life, period, would not have become what it is. That of a witness who believes he has a moral obligation to try to prevent the enemies from enjoying one last victory by allowing his crimes to be erased from human memory. For today, thanks to recently discovered documents, the evidence shows that in the early days of their ascension to power, the Nazis in Germany set out to build a society in which there simply would be no room for Jews. Towards the end of their reign, their goal changed. They decided to leave behind a world in ruins in which Jews would seem to have never existed. This is why everywhere in Russia, in the Ukraine, in Lithuania, in the Einsatzgruppen carried out the final solution by turning their machine guns on more than 1 million Jews, men, women, and children, and throwing them into mass graves, dug just moments before by the victims themselves. Special units would then disinter the corpses and burn them. Thus, for the first time in history, Jews were not only killed twice, but denied burial in a cemetery. It is obvious that the war which Hitler and his accomplices waged was a war not only against Jewish men, women, and children, but also against Jewish religion, Jewish culture, Jewish tradition, and therefore Jewish memory. Convinced that this period in history would be judged one day, I knew I must bear witness. I also knew that while I had many things to say, I did not have the words to say them. Painfully aware of my limitations, I watched helplessly as language became an obstacle. It became clear that it would be necessary to invent a new language. But how is one to rehabilitate and transform words betrayed and perverted by the enemies? Hunger, thirst, fear, transport, selection, fire, chimney. These words all have intrinsic meaning, but in those times, they meant something else. Writing in my mother tongue, at that point close to extinction, I would pause at every sentence and start over and over again. I would conjure up the verbs, other images, other silent cries. It was still not right. But what exactly was it? It was something elusive, darkly shrouded for fear of being usurped, profaned. All the dictionary had to offer seemed meager, pale, and lifeless. Was there a way to describe the last journey in sealed cattle cars, the last voyage towards the unknown, of the discovery of a demented and glacial universe where to be inhuman was human, where disciplined, educated men in uniform came to kill, and innocent children and weary old men came to die? or the countless separations of a fiery single night, the tearing apart of families, entire communities, or incredibly, the vanishing of a beautiful, well-behaved little Jewish girl with golden hair and a sad smile, murdered with her mother the very night of their arrival. How is one to speak of them without trembling and a heart broken for all eternity? Deep down, the witness knew then, as he does now, that his testimony would not be received. After all, it deals with an event that sprang from the darkest zone of man. Only those who experienced Auschwitz know what it was. Others will never know, but could they at least understand? Could men and women who considered it normal to assist the weak, to heal the sick, to protect small children, and to respect the wisdom of their elders understand what happened here? Would they be able to comprehend how, within the cursed universe, the masters tortured the weak and massacred the children, the sick, and the old? And yet, having lived through this experience, one could not keep silent no matter how difficult, if not impossible, it was to speak. And so I persevered and trusted the silence that envelops and transcends words, knowing all the while that any one of the fields of ashes in Birkenau carries more weight than all the testimonies about Birkenau. For despite all my attempts to articulate the unspeakable, it is still not right. Is that why my manuscript, written in Yiddish and the world remained silent, and translated first into French and then into English, was rejected by every major publisher, French and American, despite the tireless efforts of the great Catholic French writer and Nobel laureate Francois Marillac. After months and months of personal visits, letters, and telephone calls, he finally succeeded in getting it into print. Though I made numerous cuts, the original Yiddish version was long. Jerome Linden, the legendary head of a small but prestigious Editions de Mignot, edited and further cut the French version. I accepted his decision because I was worried that some of the things might be superfluous. Substance alone mattered. I was more afraid of having said too much than too little. Example, in the Yiddish version, the narrative opens with these cynical musings. In the beginning, there was faith, which was childish, trust, which is vain, and illusion, which is dangerous. We believed in God, trusted in man, and lived with the illusion that every one of us had been entrusted with a sacred spark from the Shekinah flame, and that every one of us carried in his soul, eyes and soul, a reflection of God's image. That was the source, if not the cause, of all of our ideals. Other passages from the original Yiddish version had more on the death of my father and on the liberation. Why not include those in his new translation? Too personal, too private, perhaps. They needed to remain between the lines, and yet. So what we're reading next is something that was going to happen later in the book. We're reading his original text, where when we eventually actually get to the book, it is the translated version. So this is the original part, and this is what we have to look forward to as a kind of a spoiler as to what's going to happen. I remember the night, the most horrendous of my life. Eliezer, my son, come here. I want to tell you something, only to you. Come, don't leave me alone, Eliezer. I heard his voice, grasped the meaning behind the words and the tragic dimension of the moment, yet I did not move. It had been his last wish to have me next to him in his agony. And at that moment, when his soul was tearing itself from his lacerated body, yet I did not let him have his wish. I was afraid of the blows. That is why I remained deaf to his cries. Instead of sacrificing my miserable life and rushing to his side, taking his hand, reassuring him, showing them that he was not abandoned, that I was near him, that I felt his sorrow. Instead of all of that, I remained flat on my back, asking God to make my father stop calling my name, to make him stop crying. So afraid was I to incur the wrath of the SS. In fact, my father was no longer conscious, yet his plaintive heroine voice went on piercing the silence and calling nobody but me. Well, the SS had flown into a rage and was striking my father on the head. Be quiet, old man, be quiet. My father was no longer felt the club's blows. I did. And yet I did not react. I let the SS beat my father. I left him alone in the clutches of death. Worse, I was angry with him for having been noisy, for having cried, and for provoking the wrath of the SS. Eliezer, come, don't leave me alone. His voice had reached me from so far away, from so close, but I had not moved. I shall never forgive myself, nor shall I ever forgive the world for having pushed me against the wall, for having turned me into a stranger, for having awakened in me the most basest, most primitive instincts, His last words had been a name, a summons, and I had not responded. So he watched the SS beat his father to death, and he prayed for God that his father would die so that he didn't get in trouble. So this is the type of stuff that we're going to be getting into this novel. It is not a pretty story. And specifically, how does someone turn into, what do you have to go through at that point to wish that upon your father, to wish that he gets beaten to death? That is what this novel's about. It is brutal. So in the Yiddish version, the narrative does not end with the image in the mirror, but in a gloomy meditation on the present. And now, scarcely 10 years after Buchenwald, I realize that the world forgets quickly. Today, Germany is a sovereign state. The German army has been resuscitated. Ilse Koch, the notorious sadistic monster of the Buchenwald, was allowed to have children and live happily ever after. War criminals stroll through the streets of Hamburg and Munich. The past seems to have been erased, relegated to oblivion. Today, there are anti-Semites in Germany, France, and even the United States who tell the world that the story of the 6 million assassinated Jews and 5 million more people is nothing but a hoax. And many people, not knowing any better, may well believe them, if not today, then tomorrow or the day after. I was not so naive as to believe them that this slim volume would change the course of history or shake the conscience of the world. Books no longer have the power they did. Those who kept silent yesterday will remain silent tomorrow. The reader would be entitled to ask, why this new translation, since the earlier one had been around for 45 years? If it is not faithful or not good enough, why did I wait so long to replace it with one better and closer to the original? In response, I would say only that back then I was an unknown writer who was just getting started. My English was far from good, and when my British publisher told me that he had found a translator, I was pleased. I later read the translation and it seemed all right. I never reread it. Since then, many of my other works have been translated by Marian, my wife, who knows my voice and how to transmit it better than anyone else. I am fortunate. When Farr, Strauss, and Yerkes asked me to replace a new translation, she accepted. I am convinced that the readers will appreciate her work. In fact, as a result of her rigorous editing, I was able to correct and revise a number of important details. And so I reread this text written so long ago. I am glad that I did not wait any longer. And yet I still wonder, have I used the right words? I speak of my first night over there, the discovery of the reality inside the barbed wire, the warnings of a veteran inmate, counseling my father and myself to lie about our ages. My father was to make himself younger and I older, the selection, the march towards the chimney looming in the distance under an indifferent sky, the infants thrown into fiery ditches. I did not say that they were alive, but that was what I thought. But then I convinced myself, no, they were dead. Otherwise, I surely would have lost my mind. And yet fellow inmates also saw them. They were alive when they were thrown into the flames. Historians among them, Telford Taylor confirmed it. And yet I somehow did not lose my mind. Before concluding this introduction, I believe it important to emphasize how strongly I feel that books, just like people, have a destiny. Some invite sorrow, others joy, and some both. Earlier, I described the difficulties encountered by Knights before its publication in French, 47 years ago. Despite overwhelmingly favorable reviews, the book sold poorly. The subject was considered morbid and interested no one. If a rabbi happened to mention the book in his sermon, there were always people ready to complain that it was senseless to burden our children with the tragedies of the Jewish past. Since then, much has changed. Knight has been received in ways I never expected. Today, students in high schools and colleges in the United States and elsewhere read it as part of their curriculum. How to explain this phenomenon? First of all, there has been a powerful change in the public's attitude. In the 50s and 60s, adults born before or during World War II showed a careless and patronizing indifference towards what is so inadequately called the Holocaust, and that is no longer true. Back then, few publishers had the courage to publish books on that subject. Today, such works are on most books lists. The same is true in academia. Back then, few schools offered courses on the subject. Today, many do, and strangely, those courses are particularly popular. The topic of Auschwitz has become a mainstream culture. There are films, plays, novels, international conferences, exhibitions, annual ceremonies with the participation of the nation's officialdom. The most striking example is that of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. It has received more than 22 million visitors since its inauguration in 1993. This may be because the public knows that the number of survivors is shrinking daily and is fascinated by the idea of sharing memories that will soon be lost. For in the end, it is all about memory, its sources and its magnitude, and of course, its consequences. For the survivors who choose to testify, it is clear his duty is to bear witness for the dead and the living. He has no right to deprive future generations of a past that belongs to our collective memory. To forget would not only be dangerous, but offensive. To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. Sometimes I am asked if I know the response to Auschwitz. I answer that not only do I not know it, but I don't even know if a tragedy of this magnitude has a response. What I do know is that if there is a response, that there is a response in responsibility. What we speak of this era of evil and darkness, so close and yet so distant, responsibility is the key word. The witness has forced himself to testify, but for the youth of today, for the children who will be born tomorrow, he does not want his past to become their future. And so that's our preface there. We'll get straight into the book after that, but I feel like the preface is quite important to read through because it really talks about the author and what he feels like, why he's talking, why this novel is quite short actually, but all of that goes on. And of course, again, it's kind of a nice teaser here into what we can expect. Like I said, he prayed to God for his father to die. Sorry, 1 second. I'm just looking at something. Okay. So we're not going to go through I don't think we are. No, we're not going to go through the foreword. The foreword was written by Francois Marc, and this is a 45-year-old foreword. And I don't remember there being much substance in it that's necessary, any additional substance. So we're going to go straight to chapter 1. Now, one thing to note is there's no actual numbers on the page. So it's on page 3 is chapter 1. In fact, what I recommend you guys do is really, really quickly before we get going, flip open to your book here. You're going to notice there's some questions. Just write in just page 3 beside chapter 1 here. Because it will be difficult to go back and find this stuff otherwise, I promise you. I learned that the hard way. So just flip over there, put page 3. Okay, so we're going to start reading through this now. So they called him Moshe the Beetle, as if his entire life he had never had a surname. He was the jack of all trades in a Hasidic house of prayer, a shtibel. The Jews of Siget, the tiny town in Transylvania where I spent my childhood, were fond of him. He was poor and lived in utter penury. As a rule, our townspeople, while they did help the needy, did not particularly like them. Moshe the Beetle was an exception. He stayed out of people's way. His presence bothered no one. He had mastered the art of rendering himself insignificant, invisible. Physically, he was as awkward as a clown. His waffle-like shyness made people smile. As for me, I liked his wide, dreamy eyes, gazing off into the distance. He spoke little. He sang, or rather, he chanted, and a few of the snatches I caught here and there spoke of divine suffering, of the Shekinah in exile, where, according to Kabbalah, it awaits his redemption linked to that of a man. I met him in 1941. I was almost 13 and deeply observant. By day, I studied the Talmud, and by night, I would run to the synagogue to weep over the destruction of the temple. This is him now. So this is him as a teenager. So, and again, this is his story. This is actually happened. So this is Ellie. And he goes by Eliezer in the novel. One day I asked my father to find me a master who could guide me in the studies of Kabbalah. You are too young for that. Maimonides tell us that one must be at least 30 before venturing into the world of mysticism, a world fraught with peril. First, you must study the basic subjects. Those you are able to comprehend. My father was a cultured man and rather unsentimental. He rarely displayed his feelings, not even within his family, and was more involved with the welfare of others than that of his own kin. The Jewish community of Siget held him in the highest esteem. His advice on public and even private matters was frequently sought. And there were 4 of us children, Hilda the eldest, then Bia. I was third and the only son, and Tzipporah was the youngest. My parents ran a store. Hilda and Bia helped with some of the work. As for me, my place was in the house of study, or so they said. There are no Kabbalists in Siget, my father would often tell me. He wanted to drive the idea of studying Kabbalah from my mind. In vain, I succeeded on my own in finding a master for myself in the person of Moshe the Beadle. He watched me one day as I prayed at dusk. Why do you cry when you pray? He asked, as though he knew me well. I don't know, I answered, troubled. I have never asked myself that question. I cried because something inside me felt the need to cry. That was all I knew. And why do you pray? He asked for a moment. Why did I pray? Strange question. Why did I live? Why did I breathe? I don't know, I told him, even more troubled and ill at ease. I don't know. From that day on, I saw him often. He explained to me with great emphasis that every question possessed a power that was lost in the answer. Man comes closer to God through the questions he asks him, he liked to say. Therein lies true dialogue. Man asks and God replies, but we don't understand his replies. We cannot understand them because they dwell in the depths of our souls and remain there until we die. The real answers, Eliezer, we will find only within yourself. And why do you pray, Moshe? I asked him. I pray to God within me for the strength to ask him the real questions. We spoke that way almost every evening, remaining in the synagogue long after all the faithful had gone, sitting in the semi-darkness where only a few half-burnt candles provided a flicker in light. One evening, I told him how unhappy I was to be able to find how unhappy I was not to be able to find in Siget a master to teach me the Zohar, the Kabbalistic works, the secrets of Jewish mysticism. He smiled indulgently, and after a long silence, he said, there are 1,001 gates allowing entry into the orchard and the mystical truth. Every human being has his own gate. He must not err and wish to enter the orchard through a gate other than his own. That would present a danger not only to one in entering, but also to those who are already inside. And Moshe the Beal, the poorest of the poor in Siget, spoke to me on hours on end about the Kabbalah revolutions and in mysteries. Thus began my initiation. Together we would read over and over again the same pages of the Zohar, not to learn it by heart, but to discover within the very essence of divinity. And in the courses of those evenings, I became convinced that Moshe the Beadle would help me enter eternity, into that time when question and answer would become one. So what's he doing? He is studying religious texts extensively. He is deeply, deeply religious at this time in his life when he's 13 years old.
He's studying what?
He's studying the religious texts, essentially. And then one day, all foreign Jews were expelled from Siget, and Moshe the Beadle was a foreigner. Crammed into cattle cars by Hungarian police, they cried silently. Standing on the station platform, we too were crying. The train disappeared over the horizon, and all that was left was thick, dirty smoke. Behind me, someone said, sighing, what do you expect? That's war. Keep in mind, so this is 1941. World War II is raging on. So this is how World War II has been started before this text even started. The deportees were quickly forgotten. A few days after it was left, it was rumored that they were in Galicia working, and even that they were content with their fate. Days went by, then weeks and months. Life was normal again. A calm, reassuring wind blew through our homes. The shopkeepers were doing good business, and students lived among their books, and the children played in the streets. One day, as I was about to enter the synagogue, I saw Moshe the Beadle sitting on a bench near the entrance. He told me what had happened to him and his companions. The train within the deportees had crossed the Hungarian border, and once in Polish territory, had been taken over by the Gestapo. The train had stopped. The Jews were ordered to get off and onto waiting trucks. The trucks headed towards a forest. There, everybody was ordered to get out. They were forced to dig huge trenches. When they'd finished their work, the men from the Gestapo began theirs. Without passion or haste, they shot their prisoners, who were forced to approach the trench one by one and offer their necks. Infants were tossed into the air and used as target for their machine guns. This took place in the Galician forest near Colomé. How had he, Moshe the beetle, been able to escape? By a miracle. He was wounded in the leg and left for dead. So Moshe the beetle said that they were forced to dig their graves and then shot. Day after day, night after night, he went from one Jewish house to the next, telling his story and that of Malka, the young girl who had laid dying for 3 days, and that of Toby, the tailor who had begged to die before his sons were killed. Moshe was not the same. The joy in his eyes were gone. He no longer mentioned either God or Kabbalah. He spoke only of what he had seen, but people not only refused to believe his tales, they refused to listen. Some even insinuated that he only wanted their pity and that he was imagining things. Others flatly said that he had gone mad. As for Moshe, he wept and pleaded. Jews, listen to me. That's all I ask of you. No money, no pity, just listen to me. He kept shouting in synagogue between the prayer at dusk and the evening prayer. Even I did not believe him. I often sat with him after services and listened to his tales, trying to understand his grief, but all I felt was pity. They think I'm mad, he whispered, and tears like drops of wax flowed from his eyes. Once I asked him the question, why do you want people to believe you so much? In your place, I would not care whether they believed me or not. He closed his eyes as if to escape time. You don't understand, he said in despair. You cannot understand. I was saved miraculously. I succeeded in coming back. Where did I get my strength? I wanted to return to Sighet to describe to you my death so that you might ready yourselves while there is still time. Life, I no longer care to live. I am alone. But I wanted to come back to warn you, and no one is listening to me. And that was at the end of 1942. Thereafter, life seemed normal once again. London radio, which we listened to every day, every evening, announced encouraging news. The daily bombings of Germany and Stalingrad, the preparation of the Second Front. And so we, the Jews of Sighet, waited for better days that were sure to come soon. I continued to devote myself to my studies. Talmud during the day and Kabbalah at night. My father took care of his business and the community. My father came to spend Rosh Hashanah with us so that he could attend the services as we celebrated Rebbe of Borscht. My mother was beginning to think it was high time for us to find an appropriate match for Hilda, that's his sister. Thus passed the year of 1943. So I really quickly just want to take a step back here. So this book started in 1941, and now we're at the end of 1943. So he has lived for 2.5 years now through this war, and with this knowledge that Moshe the Beetle is claiming that these Jews were escorted out and told to dig their graves and got shot at, that no one believed in him. So thus we enter spring of 1944, and this is where the story truly begins. Spring 1944, splendid news from the Russian front. There could no longer be any doubt. Germany would be defeated. It was only a matter of time, months or weeks perhaps. The trees were in bloom. It was a year like so many others, with its spring, its engagements, its weddings, and its births. The people were saying the Red Army is advancing with giant strides. Hitler will not be able to harm us, even if he wants to. And yet we even doubted his resolve to, we even doubted his resolve to exterminate us. Annihilate an entire people, white out a population dispersed through so many nations, so many millions of people. By what means? In the middle of the 20th century? And thus my elders concerned themselves with all manner of things, strategy, diplomacy, politics, and Zionism, but not with their own fate. Even Moshe the Beetle had fallen silent. He was weary of talking. He would drift through synagogue or through the streets, hunched over, eyes cast down, avoiding people's gaze. In those days, it was still possible to buy immigration certificates to Palestine. I asked my father to sell everything, to liquidate everything, and to leave. I am too old, my son, he answered. Too old to start a new life, too old to start from scratch in some distant land. The Budapest radio announced that the fascist party had seized power. The regent Miklos Horthy was forced to ask a leader of the pro-Nazi nihilist party to form a new government. Yet we still were not worried. Of course, we had heard of the fascists, but it was all in the abstract. It meant nothing more to us than a change in ministry. The next day brought really disquieting news. German troops had penetrated Hungarian territory with the government's approval. Finally, people began to worry in earnest. One of my friends, Moshe Berkowitz, returned from the capital for Passover and told us the Jews in Budapest live in an atmosphere of fear and terror. Anti-Semitic acts take place every day in the streets, on the trains. The fascist attacks German stores, synagogues. The situation has become very serious. The news spread through the Sighet like wildfire. Soon that was all that people talked about, but not for long. Optimism soon revived. The Germans will not come this far. They will stay in Budapest for strategic reasons, for political reasons. And in less than 3 days, the German army vehicles made their appearance on our street. So all through this tale, we have gone through 3 years now, 3 years of disbelief that it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It doesn't make sense. Why would someone do that? How could someone do that? Disbelief. And thus the Germany is now literally at their front door. Anguish. German soldiers with their steel helmets and their death head emblem. Still, our first impressions of the Germans were rather reassuring. The officers were billeted in private homes, even Jewish homes, and their attitude towards their hosts was distant but polite. They never demanded the impossible, made no offensive remarks, and sometimes even smiled at the lady of the house. A German officer lodged in the Khan's house across the street from us, and we were told he was a charming man, calm, likable, and polite. 3 days after he moved in, he brought Mrs. Khan a box of chocolates. The optimists were jubilant. Well, what did we tell you? You wouldn't believe us. There they are, the Germans. What are you saying now? Where is their famous cruelty? The Germans were already in our town. The fascists were already in power, and the verdict was already out. And the Jews of Sighet were still smiling. The 8 days of Passover. The weather was sublime. My mother was busy in the kitchen. The synagogues were no longer open, and people gathered in private homes. No need to provoke the Germans. Almost every rabbi's home became a house of prayer. We drank, we ate, we sang. The Bible commands us to rejoice throughout the 8 days of celebration, but our hearts were not in it. We wish the holiday would end so as not to have to pretend. On the 7th day of Passover, the curtain finally rose. The Germans arrested the leaders of the Jewish community. From that moment on, everything happened quickly, very quickly. The race towards death had begun. The first edict: Jews were prohibited from leaving their residences for 3 days under penalty of death. Moshe the Beetle came running to our house. I warned you, he shouted, and left without waiting for a response. The same day, the Hungarian police burst into every Jewish home in town. A Jew was henceforth forbidden to own gold, jewelry, or any valuables. Everything had to be handed over to the authorities under penalty of death. My father went down to the cellar and buried our savings. As for my mother, she went on tending to the many chores in the house. Sometimes she would stop and gaze at us in silence. 3 days later, a new decree. Every Jew had to wear the yellow star. The yellow star is very infamous. You know, it's the mark that identifies that this person's a Jew and this person's not a Jew. Some prominent members of the community came to consult with my father, who had connections at the upper levels of the Hungarian police, and they wanted to know what he thought of the situation. My father's view was that it was not all bleak, or perhaps he just did not want to discourage others, to throw salt on their wounds. The yellow star, so what? It is not lethal. Poor father, of what then did you die? That is an incredibly powerful quote there. The yellow star, it's not lethal. We now know, 80 years in the future, being branded as the Jew with this yellow star was in fact a death sentence. But new edicts were already being issued. We no longer had the right to frequent restaurants or cafes, to travel by rail, to attend the synagogue, or to be on the streets after 6 o'clock in the evening. And then came the ghettos. 2 ghettos were created in the Sighet. A large one at the center of town occupied 4 streets, and another smaller one extended to over several alleyways on the outskirts of town. So ghettos are where they're taking every Jew and they're cramming them to a very small region. So a bunch of public buildings. So it's incredibly dense population-wise. The streets we lived on, Serpent Street, was in the first ghetto. We therefore could remain in our house, but as it occupied a corner, the windows facing the street outside the ghetto had to be sealed. We gave some of our rooms to relatives who had been driven out of their homes. Little by little, life returned to quote unquote normal. The barbed wire that encircled us like a wall did not fill us with real fear. In fact, we felt that was not a bad thing. We were entirely among ourselves, a small Jewish republic. A Jewish council was appointed, as well as a Jewish police force, a welfare agency, a labor committee, a health agency, a whole government apparatus. People thought that this was a good thing. We would no longer have to look at all those hostile faces, endure those hate-filled stares. No more fear, no more anguish. We would live among the Jews, among brothers. Of course, there were still unpleasant moments. Every day, the Germans came looking for men to unload coal to military trains. Volunteers for this kind of work were rare, but apart from that, the atmosphere was oddly peaceful and reassuring. Many people thought that we would remain in the ghetto until the end of the war, until the arrival of the Red Army, that is the Soviets, the Russians. Afterwards, everything would be just as before. The ghetto was to be ruled by neither German nor Jew. It was ruled by delusion. They are being delusional. Some 2 weeks before Shabbat, a sunny spring day, people strolled seemingly carefree through the crowded streets. They exchanged cheerful greetings. Children played games, rolling hazelnuts on the sidewalks. Some schoolmates and I were in Ezra Malik's garden, studying a Talmud treatise. Night fell, and some 20 people had gathered in our courtyard. My father was sharing some anecdotes and holding forth his opinion on the situation. He was a good storyteller. Suddenly, the gate opened, and Stern, a former shopkeeper who was now a policeman, entered and took my father aside. Despite the growing darkness, I could see my father turn pale. "What's wrong?" we asked. "I don't know. I have been summoned to a special meeting of the council. Something must have happened." The story he had interrupted would remain unfinished. "I'm going right now. I'll return as soon as possible. I'll tell you everything. Wait for me." We were ready to wait as long as necessary. The courtyard had turned into something like an antechamber of the operating room. We stood waiting for the door to open. Neighbors heard the rumors, had joined us. We stared at our watches. Time had slowed down. What was the meaning of such a long session? "I have a bad feeling," said my mother. "This afternoon I saw new faces in the ghetto, 2 German officers. I believe they were Gestapo. Since we've been here, we have not seen a single officer." It was close to midnight. Nobody felt like going to sleep. Though some people briefly went to check their homes. Others left, but asked to be called as soon as my father reappeared. There it is. Okay, at last the door opened and he appeared. His face was drained of color and he was quickly surrounded. Tell us what's happening. Say something." At this moment, we were so anxious to hear something encouraging, a few words telling us that there'd be nothing to worry about and that the meeting had been routine, just a review of the welfare and health problems. But one glance at my father's face left no doubt. "The news is terrible," he said at last. And then one word: transports. The ghetto was to be liquidated entirely. Departures were to take place street by street, starting the next day. We wanted to know everything, every detail. We were stunned, yet we wanted to fully absorb the bitter news. Where will they take us? That was a secret for all except one, the president of the Jewish council. But he would not tell, or could not tell. The Gestapo had threatened to shoot him if he talked. Sorry, I'm just... So they mentioned the Gestapo a lot. That's the Germans' like secret police, essentially. So when you see Gestapo, it's German police. "There are rumors," my father said, his voice breaking, "that we are being taken somewhere in Hungary to work in the brick factories. It seems that here we are too close to the front." And after a moment's silence, he added, "Each of us will be allowed to bring his personal belongings, a backpack, some food, a few items of clothing, nothing else." Again, heavy silence. "Go and wake the neighbors," said my father. "They must get ready." The shadows around me roused themselves as if from a deep sleep and left silently in every direction. We're going to finish this chapter, then we'll go for a break. We have a couple pages left, so you will get it. For a moment, we remained alone, and suddenly Basia Reach, a relative who had lived with us, entered the room. "Someone is knocking at the sealed window, the one that faces outside." It was only after the war that I found out who had knocked that night. It was an inspector of the Hungarian police, a friend of my father's. Before we entered the ghetto, he had told us, "Don't worry, I'll warn you if there's danger." Had he been able to speak to us that night, we might still have been able to flee. But by the time we succeeded in opening the window, it was too late. There was nobody outside. The ghetto was awake, and one after the other, the lights were going on behind the windows. I went into the house of one of my father's friends. I woke the head of the household, a man with a gray beard and the gaze of a dreamer. His back was hunched over from untold nights spent studying. Get up, sir, get up. You must ready yourself for the journey. Tomorrow you will be expelled, you and your family, you and all the other Jews. Where to? Please don't ask me, sir. Don't ask questions. God alone could answer you. For heaven's sake, get up. He had no idea what I was talking about. He probably thought I had lost my mind. What are you saying? Get ready for the journey? What journey? Why? What is happening? Have you gone mad? Half asleep, he was staring at me, his eyes filled with terror, as though he expected me to burst out laughing and told him to go back to sleep, to dream, that nothing had happened. It was all in jest. My throat was dry, and the words were choking me, paralyzing my lip. There was nothing else to say. At last he understood. He got out of the bed and began to dress automatically. Then he went over to the bed where his wife lay sleeping, and with infinite tenderness touched her forehead. She opened her eyes, and it seemed to me that a smile had crossed her lips. Then he went on to wake his two children. They woke with a start, torn from their dreams, and I fled. The time went by quickly. It was already 4 o'clock in the morning. My father was running left and right, exhausted, consoling friends, checking with the Jewish council just in case the order had been rescinded. At the last moment, people clung to hope. The women were boiling eggs, roasting meat, preparing cakes, and sewing backpacks. The children were wandering around aimlessly, not knowing what to do themselves to stay out of the way of the grown-ups. Our backyard looked like a marketplace. Valuable objects, precious rugs, silver candlesticks, Bibles, and other ritual objects had been strewn over the dusty grounds. Pitiful relics that seemed never to have had a home. All this under a magnificent blue sky. By 8 o'clock in the morning, weariness had settled into our veins, our limbs, our brains. Like molten lead, I was in the midst of prayer when suddenly there was a shouting in the streets. I quickly unwound my phylacteries and ran to the window. The Hungarian police had entered the ghetto and were yelling in the street nearby. All Jews outside hurried. They were followed by the Jewish police, who, their voices breaking, told us, the time has come. You must leave all of this. The Hungarian police used their rifle butts, their clubs to indiscriminately strike old men and women, children and cripples. One by one, the houses emptied and the streets filled with people carrying bundles. By 10 o'clock, everyone was outside. The police were taking roll calls once, twice, 20 times. The heat was oppressive. Sweat streamed down people's faces and bodies. Children were crying for water. There was water close by inside the house, the backyards, but it was forbidden to break rank. Water, mother, I am thirsty. Some of the Jewish police surreptitiously went to fill a few jugs. My sister and I were allowed to move about as we were destined for the last convoy, so we helped the best we could. At last, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the signal came to leave. There was joy. Yes, joy. People must have thought there could be no greater torment in God's hell than that of being made to stand here on the sidewalk among the bundles in the middle of a street under a blazing sun. Anything seemed preferable to that. They began to walk without another glance at the abandoned streets, the dead, empty houses, the gardens, and the tombstones. On everyone's back, there was a sack. In everyone's eyes, tears and distress. Slowly, heavily, the procession advanced towards the gate of the ghetto. And there I was, on the sidewalk, watching them file past, unable to move. Here came the chief rabbi, hunched over, his face strange, looking without a beard, a bundle on his back. His very presence in the processions was enough to make the scene seem surreal. It was like a page torn from a book, a historical novel, perhaps, dealing with the captivity in Babylon or the Spanish Inquisition. They passed me by, one after the other, my teachers, my friends, and others, some of whom I had once feared, some of whom I had found ridiculous, all those whose lives I had shared for years. There they went, defeated, their bundles, their lives in tow, having left behind their homes and their childhood. This is the loss of their innocence. They passed by me like beaten dogs, with never a glance in my direction. They must have envied me. The procession disappeared around the corner. A few steps more and they were beyond the ghetto walls. The street resembled fairgrounds, deserted in haste. There was a little of everything: suitcases, briefcases, bags, knives, dishes, banknotes, paper, faded portraits, all things once planned to take along and finally left. They had ceased to matter. Open rooms everywhere, gaping doors and windows looked out into the void. It all belonged to everyone, since it no longer belonged to anyone. It was there for the taking, an open tomb, a summer sun. We had spent the day without food, but we were not really hungry. We were exhausted. My father had accompanied the deportees as far as the ghetto's gate. They first had herded through the main synagogue, where they were thoroughly searched to make sure they were not carrying away gold, silver, or other valuables. There had been incidents of hysteria and harsh blows. When will it be our turn? I asked my father. The day after tomorrow, unless things work out. A miracle, perhaps. Where were the people taken? Did anyone know yet? No, the secret was well kept. Night had fallen, and that evening we went to bed early. My father said, "Sleep peacefully, children. Nothing will happen until the day after tomorrow, Tuesday." Monday went by like a small summer cloud, like a dream in the first few hours of dawn. Intent on preparing our backpacks on bacon breads and cakes, we no longer thought about anything else. The verdict had been delivered. That evening, our mother made us go to bed early to conserve our strength, she said. It was to be our last night in our house. I was up at dawn. I wanted to have time to pray before leaving. My father had risen before all of us to seek information on town. He returned around 8 o'clock. Good news, we were not leaving today. We were only moving to the small ghetto. That is where we have to wait for the last transports. We would be the last to leave. At 9 o'clock, the previous Sunday scenes were repeated. Policemen wielding clubs were shouting, all Jews outside. We were ready. I went out first. I did not want to look at my parents' face. I did not want to break into tears. We remained sitting in the middle of the street, like the others 2 days earlier, the same hellish sun, the same thirst, only there was no one left to bring us water. I looked at my house in which I had spent years seeking my God, fasting to hasten the coming of the Messiah, imagining what my life would be like later. Yet I felt sadness. My mind was empty. Get up, roll call. We stood, we were counted, we sat down. We got up again over and over. We waited impatiently to be taken away. What were they waiting for? Finally, the order came. March, forward and march. My father was crying. It was the first time I saw him cry. I had never thought it possible. As for my mother, she was walking, her face a mask, without a word, deep in thought. I looked over at my little sister, Zipporah, her blonde hair neatly combed, her red coat over her arm, a little girl of 7. On her back, a bag too heavy for her. She was clenching her teeth. She already knew it was useless to complain. Here and there, the police were lashing out with their clubs. Faster, I had no strength left. The journey had just begun, and I already felt so weak. When he talks about his sister there in the red coat, if you ever do watch Schindler's List, which I do recommend, you will see the character that's based on her. Faster, faster, move, you lazy good-for-nothings, the Hungarian police were screaming. That was when I began to hate them, and my hatred remains our only link today. They were our first oppressors. They were the first faces of hell and death. They ordered us to run. We began to run. Who could have thought that we were so strong? From behind their windows, from behind their shutters, our fellow citizens watched us as we passed. We arrived at our destination. Throwing down our bundles, we dropped to the ground. O God, Master of the universe, in your infinite compassion, have mercy on us. The small ghetto. Only 3 days ago, people were living here. People who owned the things we were now using. They had been expelled, and we had already forgotten about them. The chaos was even greater here than in the large ghetto. Its inhabitants evidently had been caught by surprise. I visited the rooms that had been occupied by Uncle Mendel's family. On the table, a half-finished bowl of soup, a platter of dough waiting to be baked. Everywhere on the floor there were books. Had my uncle meant to take them along? We settled in. What a word. I went looking for wood, and my sisters lit a fire, and despite her fatigue, my mother began to prepare a meal. We cannot give up. We cannot give up, she kept repeating. People's morale was not bad. We were beginning to get used to the situation. There were those who even voiced optimism. The Germans were running out of time to expel us, they argued. Tragically, for those of us who had already been deported, it would be too late. As for us, chances were that most of us would be allowed to go into our miserable little lives until the end of the war. The ghetto was not guarded. One could enter and leave as one pleased. Maria, our former maid, came to see us. Sobbing, she begged us to come with her to her village, where she had prepared a safe shelter. My father would hear nothing of it. He told me and my big sisters, if you wish, go there. I shall stay here with your mother and the little one. Naturally, we refused to be separated. Night. No one was praying for the nights to pass quickly. The stars were but sparks of the immense conflagration that was consuming us. With this conflagration that was to be extinguished one day, nothing would be left in the sky but extinct stars and unseen eyes. There was nothing else to do but go to bed, in the bed of those who had moved on. We needed to rest to gather our strength. At daybreak, the gloom had lifted. The mood was confident, and there were those who said, "Who knows? They may be sending us away for our own good. The front is getting close. We shall soon hear the guns, and then surely the civilian population will be evacuated." They worry lest we join the partisans. As far as I'm concerned, this whole business of deportation is nothing but a big farce. And don't laugh. They just want to steal our valuables and jewelry. They know that it has to all be buried and that they have to dig to find it. So much easier to do when the owners are on vacation. On vacation. This kind of talk that nobody believed helped people pass the time. The few days we spent here were pleasantly enough in relative calm. People got along. There were no longer was any distinction between rich and poor, notable and others. We were all people condemned to the same fate, still unknown. Saturday, the day before the day of rest, was the day chosen for our expulsion. The night before, we had sat down to traditional Friday night meals. We had said that the customary blessings over the bread and the wine and swallowed the food in silence. We sensed that we were gathered around the familiar table for the last time. I spent the night going over memories and ideas and was unable to fall asleep. At dawn, we were in the street, ready to leave. This time, there were no Hungarian police. It had all been agreed that the Jewish council would handle everything by itself. Our convoy headed towards the main synagogue. The town seemed deserted, but behind the shutters, our friends of yesterday were probably waiting for the moment that they could loot our homes. The synagogue resembled a large railroad station, baggage and tears. The altar was shattered, the wall cover shredded, and the walls themselves bare. There were so many of us that we could hardly breathe. The 24 hours we spent there were horrendous. The men were downstairs, the women upstairs. It was Saturday, the Sabbath, and it was as though we were there to attend services. Forbidden to go outside, people would leave themselves in a corner. The next morning, we walked towards the station, where a convoy of cattle cars was waiting. The Hungarian police made us climb into the cars, 80 persons in each one. They handed us some bread, a few pails of water. They checked the bars on those windows to make sure they would not come loose. The cars were sealed, and one person was placed in charge of every car. If someone managed to escape, that person would be shot. 2 Gestapo officers strolled through the length of the platform. They were all smiles. All things considered, it had gone very smoothly. A prolonged whistle pierced the air. The wheels began to grind, and we were on our way. So again, we talked about Moshe the Beetle. Moshe the Beetle knows what's happening, right? The last train that he saw years ago, they were forced to dig their own graves and they got shot. And now they are also on themselves in a train car. Okay, so we'll head for a break there. Before you go, just put page 3 to 22, put chapter 1 there. It is important. You will come back to this. Chapter 1 has so many quotes. We're probably going to end up doing a quick glance through it again at the end when we finish the novel. That said, we're not going to go through chapter 2 today. So we'll take our 15-minute break and we're going to start dissecting some of this stuff. So what we're kind of going to start out here is, so we've read the preface, we've read chapter 1. So what I'll give you like, I don't know, like 20-25 minutes or something. About 25 minutes, maybe 30 minutes to just try and answer these. Now, you're not going to have room in here, so it would have to be on loose leaf. I'm starting to get yelled at for the amount of paper sometimes. So I had to condense a little bit. But just answer these questions. And this is not for marks. So this in itself is not marked. The only thing that's in this book that's going to end up being for marks is like the bottom 2 pages. Probably just those 2. But that said, this is still going to be really helpful as we go through everything here. If you do end up going back and you find like really helpful quotes, I recommend, like I saw you doing it, tag them with a sticky note or something. Yeah. Chapter 1 is vital if you ever write about this book. Okay, so I'll give you about 25 minutes. So just try to do your best with those. Okay, so just going over some of these questions. So we read the preface, we read chapter 1. I won't go through all, we only got like 10-ish minutes. Like I said, I know you guys aren't going to have really time to do so. In that. But how come he wrote this book? We saw a lot of this in the foreword. From the preface, sorry. Part of it was to, to teach the world, or share the knowledge. The part of it was that he mentions quite a few different quotes in here. Basically, if we recall, there was a moral obligation. He is obligated after having lived through this and survived this, a moral obligation to prevent the crimes from being erased from history. What happened was so heinous and so criminal and so against human nature that he has a moral obligation. I won't go through. So what was the cause of all of our ideals? Which page was that one? Oh, and I forget. Oh, I forget what page that quote is on. So just for the sake of time, I'm gonna wing it here. So question 5 here. So why did the Jews allow this to happen to them? What's our response to that?
They didn't think it was gonna be as large as it would be, right?
Yeah, they didn't imagine how bad it would be. No one could it was incomprehensible, how what was actually happening. So one of it is you don't want to imagine. Another one here is, again, there was denial. There was lots of denial. Denial of what was happening. It was easier to ignore and stay in comforts.
We're like friendly. It seemed like at first, right?
At first, yeah, in chapter 1, yes. Yeah. So then question 6 here. So we have that big quoted passage here close to the end. This is on page 11. It carries on page 12. So what haunts Weasel, the author? What haunts him regarding his father?
That he wished he died or something.
Yeah, so again, if you go to that, it's X1 11 at the preface there, but basically his father cried out for Ellie. This led to him being beaten to death right below him, 2 feet from him. His father was being beaten to death. this haunts him because, you know, he was afraid of being punished. He was afraid of the blows. As well, he was angry with him. He was angry with him for this. You know, he says he's never going to forgive himself. And the quote that he then is, you know, yeah, I'll just write it. I'll just write it all down. Actually, it's all pretty important. So I shall never forgive myself, nor shall I ever forgive the world for having pushed me against the wall, for having turned me to a stranger, for having awakened in me the barest, most primitive instincts.
Where is that?
That's in the preface on it's X11, so 12, very top of it, of the preface there. And so the question here, you know, is asking us, you know, what seems to haunt him? It haunts him that he stood by and watched it happen, if we really want to boil it down. Like that is an unspeakable amount of trauma, just that alone. And then finally here, sorry, I see you guys are still writing. Give me a second. And so finally, so the witness has forced himself to testify. So this is the last sentence of the preface on page 15 of the preface there. The witness has forced himself to testify for the youth of today, for the children who will be born tomorrow. He does not want his past to become their future. So what does he mean by that, like that sentence? Starting with the first part, the witness has forced himself to testify. What does that mean?
Felt he needed to.
Sorry?
Felt he needed to.
Yeah, he felt he needed to. So again, Ellie, this is the author. He witnessed horror. Like there's no real word for it, right? You know, he went through the Holocaust. Like we're gonna see what he sees. Like if if you think today is bad, it's gonna get worse. He sees terrible things, right? He's a witness to it. So when he says the witness is forced to testify, he witnessed it and he felt compelled to speak out and share his story, right? He has to testify. He doesn't want to, he has to. And it's for the youth of today, for the children who will be born tomorrow. He does not want his past to become their future. His past to become their future. Basically, he doesn't it's important that future generations know how bad it can get to prevent it from happening again, is really where we're at. Like that's that when he says by that, you know, the youth of today for the children who will be born tomorrow, He does not want his past to become their future. He doesn't want to repeat. That's a big reason why this is like, everyone knows about the Holocaust, right? Yeah, we might run a couple minutes over. I'll try and go fast. So then we ended up reading chapter 1 here. So we have Moshe the Beetle, and it's interesting that he chooses to start with Moshe the Beetle. This is the first character we're introduced to. Moshe the Beetle was his spiritual teacher, right? He was educating him on the Jewish traditions, about the religion, etc., etc. He's a guide for that. And we eventually see that Eli becomes incredibly religious. He's very religious. It's tied to his identity. It defines his identity. They give him a sense of purpose, gives him community, right? He knows all these people that he's with a synagogue. It also gives him moral guidance. Just going to scroll down a little bit. So for 3, so again, chapter 1, what do we know about the outside world? They know a lot. They know about the status of the war, right? How it's going. Are they winning? Are they losing? By how much so? How far away are they, etc. They also know about Moshe's tale, right? About that they dug their own grave and they were shot. They used the babies as target practice as they were flying through the air. Sorry, Moshe. And how do they respond? They know what's happening. For the most part, they chose to ignore the warning signs, right? They were told what was happening and none listened. And then finally, the Jews of Sighet. How'd they react to the arrival of the Germans? At first, they seemed not glad. But what would be a good word there? Let's say their anxieties were put to ease, right? It's like, oh, they're staying with us. They're giving them chocolates and stuff. At first, they weren't. They're really a little anxious, but now it's okay. It seems like it's good. But eventually, what ends up happening is they get forced into a ghetto. Every Jew gets rounded up, put into 2 small areas. They get deported. You're told to take only a little bit of stuff. You're not allowed to own gold and stuff. You're not allowed past 6 p.m. You will be shot on sight if you are. How did they react to all that?
They didn't think nothing was gonna happen, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There was compliance. They complied with everything. And why? Probably part of it was there was the threat of violence, right? You'll be shot to death, but the other one as well was they refused to believe what could come. They didn't think that they couldn't imagine what would come of these actions. And again, if we remember, they were left unguarded sometimes. They could have escaped. They could have escaped. But there was complete obedience. Now, the question here, and this is a hard question, is why? No, they didn't know for sure. They didn't know that they'd be marching to their death. But how come they were this compliant? They didn't escape. They had the chance, they didn't escape. The reason is we cling to safety and what we know. It's in our human nature. We cling to what we know. We don't like knowing, not knowing what it's going to be like. So it's a question of human nature. And so with that, once you have that done, we'll be good to go. Like I said, it's a heavy book. I'm really aware of that. It is a quick book. We're going to start with the next couple chapters here on Monday. We will be finished this book by next week.